Hi everyone and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast. Today we're diving deep into the biggest story there is, the story of us, how human societies rose from small, egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers to the vast interconnected world we live in today, and why that same system might now be on the brink. My guest is Dr Luke Kemp from the University of Cambridge's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Yes, that's a real place. And he's author of Goliath's Curse. He argues that civilization itself may be the problem, that the forces that built our cities, empires and technologies also contain the seeds of collapse. We'll be talking about why inequality makes societies fragile, what really happens when civilizations fall apart, and how understanding our distant past might just help us survive the future. So it's a big story today. So this is history at its biggest and its most urgent. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello, Luke, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories.
Good morning, Robert. How's it going?
It's good. You're based in the UK like me, I think, at the moment, aren't you?
I am in Cambridge, UK.
Yeah. So the weather outside is a bit autumnal. I think the rain stopped. What was it like in Cambridge?
It's unfortunately dreary and very, very British, which you get used to.
And you're originally from Australia.
Precisely. So a far sunnier country.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much for coming on. I really have enjoyed this book, and I read a lot of books, and this is up there with the one of the best books I've read this year, in fact. And the reason for that is, as well as being sort of historical, archaeological, philosophical, all of the above, it does actually leave you with a big question. It could have almost been titled, "Where do we go from here?"
It could have been. And unfortunately, I don't actually spend as much time as I probably should have talking about where should we go from here. There's a lot of the book is focused more upon diagnosing the problem and investigating its root causes. So understanding why we face a situation in the world today where we face so many different threats that could, in the long term, cause a global societal collapse or human extinction. It's only really in the epilogue and the conclusion I start to talk about where can we go to from here. And frankly, I think that's a topic that deserves at least another 2 or 3 books potentially. It's a very big one. And it's also in many ways a kind of exciting one because I think there's a lot of different ways we can go to from here.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll get into some of that. But first of all, Luke, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your life growing up, and what sort of made you become interested in existential risk and, the future of society and societal collapse? There's a lot there, isn't there, to go on? But how did you get into it?
There is. So I grew up in a very small part of rural Australia called Bega, known for its very poor quality cheese. So it's a town of around about 3,000 people and 3 times as many cows, most likely. And at a pretty early age, I was always interested in really big topics such as climate change, things that could impact the entire world, and trying to think through how it could help the largest number of people, essentially. When I went to the Australian National University at age 18, I had the luck to meet a climatologist called Jeanette Lindsay, who really kind of took me under her wing, pointed me towards doing further study into climate change. And in one of her classes, I was lucky enough to get selected to go to the Copenhagen climate negotiations in 2009. And it was there that I had both the experience of reading Mark Linus's 6 Degrees of Warming, which is a book which essentially goes through the impacts of each degree of warming and what's the kind of scientific knowledge we have of each of those. And at the same time, I saw how geopolitically sclerotic and frozen we were, how incapable we were at the international level of solving something like climate change. I had to sit through negotiations where my own country, Australia, our delegation was trying to essentially stall negotiations for as long as possible. This was around about 3 a.m. in the evening they were doing this. The key purpose being that the longer you stall negotiations, the more smaller delegations, such as small island states like Tuvalu, are likely to become exhausted because they don't have enough negotiators to go to each of the sessions, hence someone has to stay up all night. While the US and Australia, they usually have hundreds of people so they can swap throughout the night. But in short, that combination of seeing how bad could climate change get and also just how incapable we were politically of solving it made me start to think about the worst case scenarios more. And that's the thread that followed through into my PhD and lecturing thereafter. I lectured at the Australian National University in a range of topics, including climate change science policy. By the end of that course, the students were always dreadfully depressed. And we tried to give them some more uplifting topics, including social mobilization, so how process movements can help, and techno fixes. What are particular technological interventions that could potentially mitigate or ameliorate the effects of climate change? And that's when I started looking more into geoengineering. And you've probably heard of geoengineering, but some of your viewers may not have, so I'll just quickly give an explanation.
Well, I've heard of it, but I'd love you to explain it
Yes.
so you can widen my knowledge.
Of course. The way that geoengineering works is essentially you fire up coolants into the atmosphere. So right now we have too many greenhouse gas emissions, which essentially act as a blanket around the atmosphere, trapping heat inside. Aerosols do the opposite. They essentially reflect sunlight before it can reach the Earth's system, hence cooling the Earth. In many ways, what you're doing is treating the Earth as a thermostat. If you have too many heating agents, put up some cooling agents instead. And this could be done at a fairly low cost, probably a couple $1 billion per year. And it could also go horribly wrong in a whole bunch of different ways, which I explore in the book, for instance. But importantly, it was in the process of looking into this and thinking about, wow, there's all these ways that geoengineering can go wrong, that I started to think about all the different things that could essentially cause huge worldwide devastation apart from climate change. And it became pretty clear that even if we had complete decarbonization, we cut emissions to zero by 2050, but we had a nuclear war in 2051, we would still, unfortunately, be doomed. And I started thinking about this as a Pokemon problem. You've got to catch them all. You have to address all the different sources of existential risk. And there was essentially only a handful of institutions thinking about this very big, broad topic, one of which was the Center for Existential Risk, Center for the Study of Existential Risk, I should say, CSER.
It's difficult to say, isn't it?
It is, particularly if you try to say it too quickly as well. And yeah, CSER is one of the few bodies working on it at the University of Cambridge. So I applied for a position, was lucky enough to get one, and have been essentially working on the book ever since, approximately 7 years ago.
Well, there's an awful lot in the book, and in the space of sort of 40, 45 minutes, we obviously can't capture everything. But just on if we can go through some of the themes. I mean, I've written about 20 questions here. We won't get through them. Goliath's curse, just for listeners' benefit. What do you mean by Goliath's curse?
Goliath is the term I use for what many would call civilization. When you start writing a book on collapse, one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, what is collapsing? Naturally, people usually point to civilization as being the thing that collapses. The problem is, for a scientist, civilization is pretty poorly defined. The definitions range from things like a checklist of 10 different factors that define civilization. This was created by the archaeologist Gordon Shield, who said that civilizations have things like writing, which, for instance, the Incan Empire didn't have, despite the fact it reached from Chile to Argentina. Or civilizations have long-distance trade, even though all hunter-gatherers have long-distance trade. So the checklist never really worked. Another one is an advanced culture, which is a definition which is about as vague as it is biased against indigenous people. And the other problem with civilization is it's always been a term of propaganda. Naturally, colonization was justified as bringing civility and civilization to savages. And the actual very root of civilization comes from the Latin civilitas. And this was a term which had connotations of things like political restraint, wisdom, moderation, etc. I wanted a term which both accurately reflected what was occurring when the first civilizations arose in the world. And when you look at the very first civilizations, what they're really marked by tends to be things like large-scale inequality, mass human sacrifice. They're almost always preceded by warfare, and often the arising of different hierarchies, such as rich and poor, slave and master, and, of course, patriarchy, man and woman. The more appropriate term for what you see here is Goliath, which denotes the old biblical story of a Philistine warrior who's covered in bronze weaponry and is incredibly difficult to kill, but eventually is by a single stone slung between his eyes. And Goliath's the same. They rely upon intimidation, size, force, and violence to impose their rules, were born of the Bronze Age and are surprisingly fragile. And a Goliath I define as a collection of dominance hierarchies in which a small number of individuals essentially take resources from the rest and impose rules upon them. And you can think about this as not just being a state or an empire. So the Roman Empire or the Roman Goliath wasn't just simply the empire itself. It was also all the different hierarchies that propped the empire up, including, of course, slavery, the distinction between slave and master, patriarchy, and just the distinction between rich and poor. The empire was primarily stocked by the patrician class of the rich. Hence, a Goliath is the collection of all these dominance hierarchies that define a civilization, if you will, a society. But Goliath's curse more or less refers to the basic idea that these Goliaths always contain the seeds of their own demise.
Hobbes' delusion is a very interesting concept. Could you just explain to listeners what that is? Because that is a sort of, from what I can gather, that was the way we're sort of brought up, certainly before this book, is that civilized is better and without it, we're all going to fall to the dogs and all the rest of it. Could you just explain about Hobbes' delusion, please?
Of course. The way most of us think about collapse is heavily shaped by a single philosopher from the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes is known for many things, but one of his most influential ideas was this notion that we have a social contract between the rulers and the ruled. And the reason we have that social contract is because if we don't have some structure of authority, a king, a commander, a despot, then what happens is everyone tends to return to a state of nature. Essentially, a situation in which everyone tries to kill each other. And it's in this state of nature that life is, as in Hobbes' words, nasty, brutish, and short. And that in many ways is an empirical claim. It's a claim about how do people act when they're not covered by structures of authority. And of course, when we look at, say, for instance, post-collapse fiction, even disaster flicks, etc., they all do show one particular vision, which is that mass panic sets in, there's mass disorder, and people engage in this kind of frenzied scramble for resources and a rush towards violence. When you actually look at the studies, that's just simply not true. Even in modern disasters, things like earthquakes and cyclones, most people respond incredibly altruistically, pro-socially, and with a good degree of self-organization. In general, there's actually this idea across disaster risk studies that mass panic is a myth, which it is. And similarly, we have around about 300,000 years of human history where we didn't have large-scale authority structures. There weren't states, there were no kings, we existed as egalitarian nomadic hunter-gatherers. And we can look at that and think through, was Hobbes right? Were people highly violent? Did they lead short lives? Were they incapable of doing large-scale cooperation? And I call it Hobbes' delusion because Hobbes was essentially wrong on every single count. For instance, Hobbes thinks that in the state of nature, we're all very solitary. That's quite to the contrary. People are incredibly social. There's a good reason why the very worst punishment you can give, even in prison, is solitary confinement. We're pro-social apes. On top of that, we don't seem to be very violent. When you actually look at the systematic studies of skeletons throughout history, as well as genetic evidence, it seems like we probably had roughly a 1 to 2% lethal violence rate. In other words, for every 100 individuals born, roughly 1 or 2 of them would have died at the hands of another human, which is about the same as the modern world. And that lack of violence enabled us to do very large-scale trade, sharing of culture, etc. When we look at nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers even today, it's quite clear that while they're often in very small bands, let's say 40 to 200 people or so, they actually exist in very big societies. Those bands, only roughly 10% of them are actually genetically related closely, so close family. The rest often come from groups who even speak different tongues. They're actually quite cosmopolitan. And an individual living in a hunter-gatherer society would often know thousands of people because they're often changing between groups so frequently. And that changing, that shifting of membership across groups creates these vast webs of shared trade, technology, culture, and even genes. So 120,000 years ago, from the east coast to the west coast of Africa, we have evidence of shared musical instruments, lithic stone tools, genes, and culture. And that's one of the reasons why we survive the Ice Age, while all other different hominid species, such as Neanderthals, Denisovans, do not. Most people tend to think that Neanderthals die out because we kill them off. There's no strong evidence of that. There's only 2 Neanderthal skeletons have been found of any signs of violence, things like embedded projectiles. And there's no clear indication that was caused by humans. Instead, what we do know is that Neanderthals had very low genetic diversity. One set of burials of Neanderthals found they had the same genetic diversity as a group of endangered mountain gorillas. By comparison, we were incredibly genetically diverse because our populations were so interconnected and constantly intermingling. And that gave us essentially the kind of genetic resilience and robustness to last through some pretty big shocks and different kind of bottlenecks throughout human history. So in short, Hobbes is totally wrong. We're actually pretty pro-social. We're very good at doing large-scale cooperation, and we're naturally very egalitarian and fairly nonviolent, which is a very different picture of human history, a very different picture of human nature, and one that actually aligns much better with how humans act in times of both crisis and collapse.
I must admit, the what you just said there about the Paleolithic society and the hunter-gatherers doing this travelling and trading far away and obviously mixing the DNA makes sense. And it's not something that I personally was aware of. I had this sort of vision in my mind, as probably a lot of people do, is that there were a group of people, they lived in the same area. There were probably 100 of them or so, and perhaps they did intermingle. But I suppose if you compare them with, let's say, more modern times, the Habsburgs or something, who had all this, they didn't really sort of go outside their own family, and they died out. It's quite interesting. One thing that I wouldn't say I struggle with, but one thing I find that has whet my sort of thought process is the fact that you paint a picture of the hunter-gatherer Paleolithic people being egalitarian. So 2 questions really. Does the evidence show that was always the case? And the second part, which is probably a bigger question, is we all know what human nature is like. People have egos. And also, I would guess that amongst people like there is now, some people are naturally more intelligent, they are brighter, they are more attractive, they've got more charisma, which then sort of says, well, would people be drawn to that person as a leader? And if they did, how come they weren't corrupted by becoming their own sort of elite? What sort of, I know there's 2 big questions there, Luke, but perhaps you could explain that, because there's a lot of that in the book.
Those are 2 excellent questions, Robert. On the first, we have signs of inequality dating back to what's called the late Pleistocene in Europe, which is roughly 40,000 years or so ago. And it's worthwhile, first of all, noting that these are pretty rare. There's only a couple of dozen findings as far as I know. They're confined to Europe, and there's none prior to that period. So for the preceding, 260,000 years, there's no signs of inequality as we tend to think of it. So when archaeologists try to look for signs of inequality, they look for things like houses, which are different sizes. So one very big house amongst a set of smaller houses. They look for what are called grand burials. So individuals who are buried with goods traded from very far away, weapons, jewelry, things of kind of high value and high status. And we also tend to look to sometimes for things like grand monuments. Frequently, monuments are built in the service of a small elite or individual, such as, of course, the pyramids of Giza. But they are not always a perfect manifestation of inequality, because sometimes people do build monuments collectively for purposes of kind of public works. Each of these start popping up when you get to the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. So you start to have grand burials, you start to have a few different kind of close to monumental structures, including these houses in Siberia built from mammoth bones, basically. In the book, I cover these, and I suggest that none of those are really signs of enduring inequality. One, because we just don't see them last very long, so they're definitely not enduring. The second is even when you do have these burials of individuals, they tend to be people who are not kind of the alpha males we tend to think of when it comes to the early kings, etc. It's often people who seem to have genetic defects, so dwarfs, for instance. It's often children and women. None of that really suggests that this was the kind of signs of an early monarchy. It looks really quite different. And instead, where we tend to see all these popping up tends to be areas where you have kind of choke points for migrations of deer, aurochs, etc. The, I think, most convincing emerging picture is that these were areas where people were doing large-scale hunts, for instance. They had a very big surplus, which they had to use up, and this basically led to big explosions of creativity, culture, monuments, architecture, etc. But they were very fleeting, and they never seemed to lead to any kind of long-lasting inequality. Instead, the only real signs we have of persistent, increasing, long-standing inequality begins pretty much with agricultural intensification and really kicks off once you get the creation of the very first states in the Near East roughly 5,000 years ago. In terms of the second question, we do, of course, have a world in which not everyone is the same. There is an unequal distribution of things like hunting talent, charisma, intelligence. We don't have any evidence that this results in long-standing hierarchies, and that's probably for a few different reasons. One is that while you could be very charismatic, it's not always easy to transform that into other forms of power. You can be charismatic and really good at building a coalition, but you might be a terrible hunter and a really bad warrior. Similarly, you might be a really good hunter and very good warrior, but you might have terrible social skills. It's pretty rare you have someone who has the kind of full gambit of is someone who could be a shaman, a leader, a great hunter, and is also capable of getting lots of resources. The other problem was that we didn't have lots of resources. Most nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers don't have a storable surplus of resources, which means that even if we had someone who was a leader for a generation, they couldn't really pass on their wealth and their status to future generations. On top of all that, our nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherer ancestors, and even us today, have what we call counter-dominant strategies. Essentially a set of tactics which are used to make sure that one individual cannot dominate the group. This is based upon the work of Christopher Bohm, a very famous anthropologist, who, after a study of dozens of different societies, found that they all had pretty similar mechanisms, including things like ridicule, ostracism, kicking someone out of a group, or in the very worst cases, in-group executions. Which means that for most of human history, people who tried to dominate were more likely to earn themselves an early grave than a place in the history books. That all changes roughly 5,000 years ago or so once you get the intensification of agriculture and the construction of the very first Goliaths.
It's interesting, almost makes you sort of think, actually, it was probably a happier society then.
Strangely, it may have been. I mean, even today, when we do happiness studies, which are done in multiple different ways, but it seems to be pretty robust across the different methods, when you do happiness studies which look at nomadic egalitarians, such as the Hadza, for instance, or the Khoisan, and you compare them to even people in industrialized nations like Spain and the United States, they do appear to be happier.
Yeah.
And there's also just loads of ethnographic accounts of how these people just are pretty happy. They spend a lot of their time dancing, singing. Obviously, most of their actual work is spent essentially outdoors hiking and hunting, which, you know, people will work a good part of the year just to go on a hunting trip later on. In general, the life wasn't too bad. Even if you lived past the age of 10, your life expectancy was pretty decent, I think up towards the 50s. It wasn't a perfect life. We didn't have vaccines, for instance. We didn't have antibiotics. Infant mortality was incredibly high. So roughly 1 or 2 children would have died before reaching adulthood. So it was by no means a perfect life, but people seem to have been healthier in general. Even today, adult men across the world are 2 centimeters shorter, I should say, than their...
Yeah, that was an interesting fact that I read there. And it was interesting to read the bit about the height of people, the ages of people. And I guess they didn't have the same types of diseases that are associated with, over-processed food and stuff like that.
Well, one of the biggest ones is simply they didn't have most diseases that we tend to think of as diseases of civilization today. So mumps, measles, influenza, any zoonotic infection, including COVID-19, those are all things that more or less come hand in hand with large-scale agriculture. Once you start to get a packing together of animals, people, waste, refuse, etc., even things like, influenza are probably only a couple thousand years old. So they wouldn't have had to contend with most of the infectious diseases that we do today.
You talked about the fission fusion dynamics in some of these societies. Could you just explain to listeners what that is?
So fission fusion refers to a process in which groups come together into a kind of agglomerate and then break apart into smaller groups once again. And this happens in a whole bunch of different ways. So, for instance, nomadic egalitarians, during the day, they'll often break apart, go into separate hunting groups and foraging groups, and come back together in the evening to eat together. But there's often larger scale, more interesting versions of this. So, for instance, there are different nomadic groups across the world who essentially do fission fusion with the seasons. And they don't just change the population density, the size of the community, they also change their very culture. So, for instance, the Inuit during summer tend to exist in kind of smaller scale, more patriarchal family units. And then in the winter, they come together into much bigger groups. They actually change some of their religious rites. They tend to become much more communal, much less patriarchal as well, and even sometimes practice things like partner swapping. So their entire kind of ethos culture does shift with the seasons. And this has led some people to speculate that we've always done this and that we've always had some form of hierarchy to correspond with different seasons. In the book, I suggest that's probably not the case. Seasonal shifts during the Paleolithic were much more muted. Of course, in Africa, seasonal shifts are very different to the 4 seasons we tend to have here in Europe. And on top of all that, we just don't have any evidence that there were these like really big seasonal shifts necessarily occurring, at least in terms of impacting wealth inequality and hierarchy. You probably did see differences in, say, for instance, rites, rituals, and culture with different kind of environmental shifts, but it wasn't quite what we see with nomadic egalitarians today. But that fission fusion process, one thing I think it tells us is that we're quite flexible in terms of our social arrangements. And people are capable of putting up a hierarchy momentarily before tearing it back down quite quickly. It doesn't always have to be a tragic or dramatic thing.
For me, that was a great part of the book, to be able to understand our beginnings. Could you just talk about the bit after the Paleolithic, once the agricultural revolutions took place, what we were finding in different parts of the world? Because I think that's really interesting.
This is the time when you see the rise of Goliaths. And people almost always refer to this as the agricultural revolution. And this is somewhat misleading in 2 senses. One is it certainly was not revolutionary in pace. It takes thousands and thousands of years for agricultural intensification to occur, which is why archaeologists tend to talk about agricultural intensification. It wasn't just simply people found grain and started making big farms. Instead, it was a really slow process of people experimenting with different crops and then slowly scaling them up over time. The other big thing here is that it wasn't just about agriculture necessarily. When you look across the world, there are 10 different areas which independently have agricultural food production. Only 4 of those developed the world's very first states, the first kingdoms and empires of the world. And a good example here is comparing Papua New Guinea to Egypt, where 7,000 years ago, they both had agriculture. In the case of Egypt, it was primarily wheat. In the case of Papua New Guinea, they were using things like taro and bananas. Why is it that agriculture in one context doesn't seem to lead to pharaohs and pyramids, and the other it does? And what I put forward in the book is that this isn't about agriculture or even a surplus necessarily. The old tale, even told by people like Marx and Smith, was that once you had an agricultural surplus, you both needed to have someone who could coordinate the larger group of people to do things like irrigation, and you also then had the surplus to pay them to do so. That doesn't appear to be the case. Instead, what really makes the difference here is the type of resource you have, what I call lootable resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored. And that explains the difference between Egypt and Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, taro and banana cannot be stored for a long period of time. bananas for roughly a month, taro for roughly 6 months. Taros are also pretty invisible. When you have it underground, it's very difficult to see where it is. And even when it's ready to be harvested, you can still leave it in there in the ground for a few months. In comparison, wheat advertises itself when it's ready to be harvested. It has a very particular harvest time. You can store it for decades. It's the perfect lootable resource. And that's why you see all the earliest Goliaths being based upon things like wheat, corn, and rice. And it's also why hunter-gatherers can sometimes become much more hierarchical, unequal, and even start to develop slave systems and systems of warfare. In almost every case, that's usually hunter-gatherer groups who start to get access to aquatic resources. Things like fish, which they can smoke and essentially make into a lootable resource. In short, lootable resources start to explain why you see hierarchy and inequality emerging across the world. But that's not the only part of the story. Agriculture by itself is one element of what creates these big Goliaths, these first empires that spread across the world. But it's also what I call monopolizable weapons. So in the Near East and China, you don't see the very first states pop up until you get the introduction of handheld bronze axes and swords. And last but not least, the final ingredient is caged land. Areas where people have few exit options, it's harder to move away, are more likely to develop states. So Mesopotamia in Greek means the land between two rivers. Egypt, of course, is buffered between the Red Sea and the Sahara Desert. In short, those three different forms of what I call Goliath fuel, lootable resources, monopolized weapons, and caged land start to create the world's very first Goliaths, these systems of inequality, these empires. And from there, history starts to become a story of organized crime, in which you essentially have these kind of protection rackets, which are very successful, and they scale up over time. And you see pretty predictably, over thousands of years, the world's largest empires grow in size. So for around about 2,000 years, the very largest states were smaller than modern-day Egypt, so roughly 1 million square kilometers. And of course, roughly, a couple of hundred years ago, we had the British Empire, which is 42 million square kilometers. So essentially, after you have the introduction of Goliath fuel, there's a pretty clear, reliable pattern of empires and Goliaths getting bigger and more powerful over time, despite recurringly collapsing across history.
As we change from hunter-gatherers to become our own societies with colonization and empires, we've seen what happens with egos and the elite getting more and more power. If we fast forward to the present day, we've got a situation, let's say, with the threat of nuclear war in the hands of a few individuals. We've got disease that can take us. We're very vulnerable in some of these. Could you just talk a bit about where we are at the moment in terms of our Goliath state? Is it better for the average person? Are we worse off?
Oof, big questions, Robert.
I know. That's why you're on.
Well, hopefully I can answer them.
Yeah.
Over time, Goliaths do grow larger. They also tend to become more interconnected. So in the book, I talk about how you have these different sets of Goliath who seem to become interdependent upon each other. So for instance, the late Bronze Age, roughly, 4,000 years ago, you have a collection of different empires across the Near East, the Levant, and the Mediterranean, who all rely upon each other for numerous things. They have diplomatic relationships. They basically trade sons and daughters. They have intermarriages. They also trade things like tin and copper, which are the prerequisites for the alloy known as bronze, which of course the age was named after, the Bronze Age. And they're so interdependent that once one of them starts to collapse, it seems to have knock-on effects across the entire system. But in short, Goliaths grow larger and they become more interconnected. And perhaps the greatest manifestation of that is also one of the most terrible, colonization. The Goliaths from Europe have large-scale advantages, including in military, and they basically take over the rest of the world and start to create a new, what I call global Goliath, a single collection of dominance hierarchies that rule over the entire world, which is the one we live in today. Every single country, every single state lives in one global economic system, global economic capitalism. Even countries who claim not to, such as China, they're ultimately still capitalists. They still trade and exist in the same global markets. We all have very similar ways of processing and understanding information. Every state has a bureaucracy. Most states and people have access to things like Google and Meta, which are, of course, just large-scale information platforms, surveillance capitalist platforms, as we call them. And most countries have pretty similar laws in some ways. There's a reason you can easily trade money and move money across borders, whether it's Saudi Arabia, China, or the United States. It's because private property law is all based upon either British common law or New York state property law. On top of that, most of our countries look surprisingly similar. There's a myriad of different ways you could organize a society, and yet in almost every single case, we have either a kind of parliamentary system or an autocratic one, either way, with one person taking power and sitting above everyone else. Our militaries also look very similar. They're almost always tiered chains of command with a commander on top. And the largest, most powerful militaries use the same weapons, such as nuclear weapons, for instance. There's almost always division between Navy, Air Force, and Army. In short, much of the world looks pretty similar because we all sit under the same kinds of dominance hierarchies. And that set of dominance hierarchies is what I call the global Goliath. And the global Goliath is also spawning some of the biggest threats we face today. Things like nuclear weapons, climate change, and new developments, technology such as engineered pandemics and artificial intelligence. What I put forward in the book is that historically, we haven't covered this too much yet, but historically, collapse has often been driven by inequality. Basically, long story short, inequality has a whole bunch of knock-on effects that tend to make empires and states much more fragile over time. Inequality by itself seems to be corrosive. It just de facto results in high levels of things like socio-political violence and even environmental degradation, which makes sense. If we're a species that's evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for equality, naturally living in unequal, lopsided societies tends to be not good for us. On top of that, inequality tends to create a shift in resources from the bottom to the top. And as you get an increasingly top-heavy society, you start to get more and more elites competing for a small number of high-status positions. This is what's sometimes called structural demographic theory, pioneered by people like Peter Turchin and Dan Hoyer. And eventually, you get a situation in which you have lots of elites competing, and you also have an increasingly poorer, more immiserated lower class, and that creates the ingredients for things like rebellions, coups, and civil wars. On top of all that, as you start to become a top-heavy society, it's also less likely you're going to have a society that's willing to change to meet oncoming disasters. Instead, elites tend to be overinvested in the status quo. I essentially survey and provide evidence for all these different knock-on effects to show that over time, inequality tends to rise, and that rising inequality tends to spill over into other forms of power. You'd have to start to get more autocratic forms of government, and that makes societies more fragile. It's what I call diminishing returns on extraction. And eventually, the kind of hollowed-out, captured state crumbles once it meets enough different shocks, things like climatic change, invaders, and disease. Today, I think that's still happening. Across the world, we had a compression of wealth inequality during the Great World Wars, basically during the 1940s and 50s. And from the 1970s onwards, we've seen global wealth inequality rising once again. And with a lag of about a decade or two, we've also seen autocracies rising once again. We've seen democratic backsliding. And I think this is all a sign of diminishing returns on extraction, and even the slide of the US towards autocracy and, of course, the cost of living crisis both in the US and here in the UK are all signs of diminishing returns on extraction. However, what worries me most is not that effect of inequality. It's instead that once you have global economic inequality, that allows the basis for these very big threats, like nuclear weapons. It's not well known, but the very first atomic weapons were built under what's called the Manhattan Project by the United States during World War II. And the Manhattan Project built its earliest nuclear weapons using uranium from a mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo called Shinkolobwe, which is named after an apple, which if you squeeze it, it leaves a burn, because most of the people who lurked in Shinkolobwe got radiation sickness. It's the purest uranium mine in the world. It was also at the time under colonial rule by the Belgians, who were known to be some of the worst colonizers in the world. And because of that, the Americans got basically cutthroat prices for uranium to build the nuclear weapons. And when you look across the world, things like artificial intelligence also requires cobalt, as do killer robots. Climate change relies upon cheap coal. AI also relies upon things like cheap workers to annotate the data. And additionally, just reams and reams of stolen data from the internet. But the key idea is that all the big threats we face today are all built on and reliant upon large-scale economic inequality. They're all produced by the global Goliath. And I think in the long term, unless you deconstruct, unless you slay that global Goliath, then we're likely to experience some kind of large-scale global catastrophe, a global societal collapse, if you will.
Which I'd like to talk about a bit later. But first of all, you mentioned that some of the things we haven't really discussed. Could you give a couple of examples, perhaps 2 or 3 examples of where over the period of the last, 12,000 years, societies have been seen they have actually collapsed, and what the results were, please?
It's worthwhile taking a step back and quickly defining collapse. There's numerous different definitions. For me, collapse is when you have multiple different power structures fragment and contract in an enduring and rapid fashion. When an economy falls apart, we call it an economic collapse, or a crash, or a depression. When a large number of people die very quickly, we call it a population or demographic bust. When a state falls apart and breaks down, we tend to call it a state failure or a state collapse. When all the different systems of power, control of information, control of resources, control of violence, and control of decision-making, when they all start to go down together, we call that a societal collapse. And there's some which people know very well, say, for instance, the classical lowland Maya, the Western Roman Empire, and there's others I cover in the book which people are probably less familiar with. So, for instance, many of the first states across the world, such as Tiwanaku, Teotihuacan, Cahokia, they all seem to go through a pattern where they rise up, and once they start to develop elites and inequality, that's when they start to become more unstable and collapse. And in some of these cases, like in the case of both Cahokia and many of the earliest farming communities and cities across the United States, they collapse and they never come back. And these are some of the most interesting because people aren't familiar with this, but roughly 1,000 years ago, the US had multiple different indigenous communities who were doing farming and building quasi-cities. And they all collapse roughly the same time. And importantly, they never come back before European colonization and invasion. There's never an indigenous empire built once again.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I was watching the other day, Michael Palin he was in Venezuela. And there was a classic case of a strong man sort of taking on the country without being democratically elected. And I think 8 or 9 million people just decided to walk away. And I think you mentioned that in your book about a lot of that collapse is the fact that people have had enough and they go somewhere else.
Precisely. It's difficult to tell sometimes, but in many of these cases, it appears that people just simply walk away from the settlement, which makes a lot of sense. When you think about it, all you're doing is scaling up a counter-dominant strategy. If previously you just kicked out someone, you ostracized them from the group and they try to dominate, now when they're being successful in dominating, what you do instead is everyone just walks away. That's one version. Another is you can think of it as a scaled-up version of in-group executions. Essentially, it's revolution or rebellion. And we see in some cases like Teotihuacan, there seems to be, and Tiwanaku as well, revolutions in which it's not the entire settlement or city that's destroyed, but instead it's basically elite residences, elite iconography, and essentially anything to do with the elites is torn down, burned, and destroyed. In both of these cases, they're basically a scaled-up version of counter-dominant strategies, which makes sense. If people are coming out of tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of equality into very different ways of life, it's natural that A, this would have been quite a precarious time, and B, they may have turned to old ways to escape from these new chains.
Religion is a good one. When I talk about religion, I don't want to confuse it with people's own natural spirituality. What I'm talking about is the way that the elites views religion to keep them in power.
It's obviously well known now that humans use fictions in order to do cooperation at a large scale. So this is an idea that's been popularized by Yuval Noah Harari in his book *Sapiens*. It's one that's been around for a while, about 2 decades prior to Yuval. There was a guy called Benedict Anderson who wrote a book about imaginary communities. But the same idea that we use fictions to hold together large groups of people. What I find most fascinating is when you look at the very early states and essentially any kind of large-scale empire, the fictions they have are always very peculiar ones. They're always fictions that justify domination. When you look at, say, for instance, the very first states, they tend to have fictions built upon the idea that the king or the pharaoh is either a god themselves or is a representative of a god. And of course, now we can look back and say, the pharaoh was almost certainly not a god. And this was almost certainly a ruse being used to justify why they were in charge, because otherwise they didn't really have much reason to be in charge of everyone else. And those different stories of subjugation, as I call them, have evolved over time. You've had things like the caste system. In China, you have the idea of the mandate of heaven, which is essentially that there's a hierarchy in the heaven which has to be replicated upon the earth. And if the emperor does their job well and abides by the kind of rules and conduct of heaven, then everything will be in harmony and order. Everything will go well. It's actually most likely a piece of propaganda used by the Zhao to justify them overthrowing the previous dynasty. And funnily enough, it's been a story that's been passed down ever since to both justify rulers, but also justify sometimes why rulers are toppled, funnily enough. But in short, almost across all of human history, we've had this idea that some people need to be on top and need to have more resources and authority than everyone else. That's a set of stories that nomadic egalitarians don't have. And it's one that even once you get egalitarian religions, it's a story that tends to be imprinted over the top of them. So things like Buddhism, Christianity, even Judaism and others, they all usually actually are quite egalitarian in a whole bunch of ways. And yet the way they tend to be co-opted and institutionalized tends to start to justify large-scale inequality and hierarchy. So Christianity need not be necessarily about a divine chain of being and command, all the way from the Pope and the King down to the commoner. And yet that's exactly the kind of system it props up over time. So in short, there's a kind of selection mechanism for these stories of subjugation, and they would help Goliaths become bigger and take control of larger number of citizens.
Looking at the future, I'm very interested to hear about what we can do. What would society look like to you if it was going to progress? And obviously we've got what we've got. I'm not saying that you would necessarily want to dismantle everything, but what can we do and what would society look like? Another big question, I know, Luke.
I suspect people both from the left and the right will find things they like about this book and things they dislike. And I've often remarked that liberals tend to be very much okay with the idea of a concentration of power in the private sector, but they're very skeptical of concentration of unaccountable power in the government. And communists and socialists tend to be the opposite. They're actually surprisingly okay with concentrations of power in the state, but are very, very critical of concentrations of power in the private sector. For me, it's more logical just to say that the problem is unaccountable concentrations of power, wherever it is. The Dutch East India Company often behaved just as badly as the British monarchy did. And my vision for the future, for how we escape what I call the end game, a time where we finally have threats that could destroy our entire global Goliath, or potentially even the human species in the longer term. The way to escape that is to basically level out those forms of unaccountable power concentration. In the book, I talk about a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. I've already spoken about different forms of power. We have violent power, political power, economic power, information power. And each of those you can start to balance out. When it comes to political power, I talk about just having more democratization. In the West, we often refer to ourselves as the great bastions and defenders of freedom and democracy. And yet, we never put our money where our mouth is. We spend at least 100 times more on mass surveillance and facial recognition technologies than we do on improving our own democracies. Democracy is a project that should be improved upon over time. It's not something we perfected just 200 years ago, which, by the way, was just one model kind of randomly developed in the UK, then exported through colonization. What I put forward is that there's lots of evidence that things like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries seem to work really quite well. They seem to decrease polarization. They often lead to far better outcomes. They have more legitimacy, at least from the people who are involved within them. And on top of all that, your selection mechanism for these things is random. You pick people by sortition or lottery. While today, what we tend to have is a system in which people who really want power and really want status and have the tools to get it tend to get to the top, which means that we get an overrepresentation of people who are both status seekers and also overrepresentation of the dark triad, psychopaths, narcissists, and Machiavellians. Pretty clear, if you're looking at the average population, at least amongst men, roughly 1 in 100 is probably going to pass the threshold for clinical psychopathy. Once you start to get to boardrooms and parliaments, it's closer to somewhere between 3 to 21%. Our system.
Yes, I read that. I wasn't surprised by it, but no, I found that very interesting.
Most people aren't.
No.
Yeah. The key thing here is that our systems aren't selecting for the best of us, which also explains why if you look at, say, for instance, the UK or the US, if you try to take the state, the government of the UK, and boil it down to a person, to be frank, they're going to be an asshole. And the same for the US as well. Like, they're just incredibly suspicious. They're constantly stockpiling weapons. No, please.
I always find it interesting that you've got, supposedly a lot of intelligent people at the tops of political parties, but the amount of energy that is spent just on politics and not on stuff.
Absolutely. And it's essentially a waste of resource as well. Naturally, we'll always have to have some kind of negotiation going on, but right now we have an incredible amount of in-group fighting and competition for very few results. I mean, in Australia, we've had so much debate over how to have an effective climate policy. At the end of the day, we kind of know technically what needs to be done. And there's actually always been pretty strong majority support across the Australian population for stronger climate action. The problem has simply been lobbying, that the mining and fossil fuel industry has an immense amount of influence over the Australian Parliament, in particular the resources sector. And this is actually true across almost every single area of existential risk. You almost always have very powerful producers, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, big tech, the military-industrial complex, who then lobby to make sure that no regulation threatens the production of these big weapons. And that's almost always done against the express wishes of most people. Most people do want to have, and this is based upon a large number of different surveys, most people, whether it's in the US or Israel, want to have an abolition of nuclear weapons. Most people want to see a moratorium on lethal autonomous weapons, also known as killer robots. Very strong majorities across the world want to see more action on climate change. The problem isn't everyday people. The problem is the way we currently do politics. The problem is power. And if you have great democratization, I think that fixes so much of this. In the book, I talk about this.
Are there any countries that are heavily involved in more democratization? Some of those assemblies that you were advocating there?
Yeah, there's been a couple of experiments. So there's been, for instance, a use of a citizens' assembly in Ireland when it came to the debate around abortion, and that was actually quite successful. They gave a set of recommendations to Parliament, which eventually led to, I believe it was after the third trimester, abortion being illegalized, but being legal before then. And that was, an incredibly fraught, heavy debate in Ireland. Similarly, France at one stage had a very big climate assembly on climate change, which led to a huge suite of over 140 recommendations. Unfortunately, most of these weren't adopted. This is actually kind of the tragedy of deliberation, that we have lots of examples of these things working really well, and yet whenever they're done, it's very rare the actual policies are implemented. And that's almost always because the policies would be effective. They're going to go up against power, and because of that, lobbyists tend to win. But nonetheless, I think this is the key way in which you can prevent existential risk from occurring. And in the book, I give one, I think, potent example of what I call a Trinity jury. The very first atomic weapon was detonated in the sands of New Mexico back in July 1945. This was what's known as the Trinity test. It was the end of the Manhattan Project. And the night beforehand, the scientists were taking bets as to whether the bomb would destroy the entire world. That's because the physicist Edward Teller had made a calculation that there was a non-zero probability that the bomb could ignite the entire atmosphere, thus killing all of life on Earth. By that time, the United States also knew the Nazis were no longer capable of nor pursuing their own nuclear program. Hence, this wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. Of course, as we know, they still went ahead and detonated the bomb anyway. I pose the question of, if you had a citizens' jury, if you randomly selected farmers, nurses, plumbers from across the United States and asked them, should we detonate this bomb, knowing there's a non-zero probability it destroys the entire world, and knowing that it's no longer necessary to win the war, what would they say? And the response I get from everyone is, of course they'd say no. That's a terrible idea. And most people, of course, would say exactly the same thing. And I believe the same is true of if you had a citizens' jury during the 1970s when Exxon decided that it was going to bury the information it had on climate change and instead put tens of millions of dollars towards sowing doubt about the science of climate change, running misinformation and disinformation campaigns. In both those cases, citizens' juries would have saved the day, basically. And I think having more democratization is one of the clearest ways in which we can balance power and prevent the construction and the production of these big threats. And I go through several others across the book, including things like having wealth taxes, a cap on wealth of $10 million. Anything more than $10 million, let's face it, is just there for status competition. And you're basically letting people compete for status while undermining our democracy. It's a very silly idea. But the key idea in the book is basically that if we level power structures, we're likely to reduce the drivers of existential risk. And from there, we just basically see what kind of society gets constructed. I don't want to put forward an entire blueprint for what utopia is. It's not my place. Instead, I want to see a system in which people are equal, free, we have good democratic forms of governance, and then we see collectively what we decide to do.
I guess if I was the American president or in the government in America, and we had a group of people who went away and came back and said, yeah, we need to disarm our nuclear weapons. If I was the president, I'd probably say, well, we can't really do that because there's some people over in the East who have got them, and we need to maintain our own security.
I tend to believe, first of all, that there's a lot of power to taking acts of leadership. And, one thing you could do here is, even if you don't want to abolish nuclear weapons, if you want to have nuclear weapons just as a deterrent against Russia, for instance, then there's no reason the United States needs to have 3,000 nuclear weapons. Most studies suggest that roughly 100 to 300 nuclear weapons is probably sufficient as a deterrent. So first of all, just do that as a kind of starting point. Negotiate with the Russians to get them to do the same, and then eventually abolish them. But I also tend to think that acts of leadership actually can have pretty big impacts. And there's, I think, a decent chance that if the United States took the responsibility of saying, you know what, we're going to basically abolish our nuclear weapons slowly over time. We're also going to basically start to heavily tax all those involved in the construction and maintenance of nuclear weapons. Russia could, of course, still fire off its nukes, but bear in mind, if Russia does that, there's still going to be a nuclear winter, which will massively affect Russia. It will basically mean that Russia is a complete international pariah for an incredibly long period of time. It may lead to its own internal discontent and rebellion, particularly if they're just basically nuclear striking a vulnerable nation. And if they don't take out all the states, like the states will still have an incredibly potent conventional military. But basically Russia would still have to half destroy itself in order to take over. Yeah. Have to bomb so many cities that it will cause nuclear winter. Yeah. I tend to think in general that things like cowardice, but also courage, tend to be contagious. And I think it's the same here. The way the nuclear weapons race started was because Russia didn't actually have many weapons at all. The United States had a series of generals and politicians who believed that Russia had a very big advantage in terms of both bombers and missiles. Neither of those was true. It was basically kind of a myth that was fabricated by them to justify larger military expenditure. The US started to massively build up its arsenals, and eventually Russia responded.
Yeah.
But I think the reverse is probably true as well. If the US or others start to disarm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think likewise, if Russia suddenly, and this is unlikely, said tomorrow, we've decided we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. We're going to have a different way towards peace, prosperity, and progress. I think it would be pretty hard for the US to justify its large arsenals.
Yeah.
They'd face immense internal pressure, and it'd be increasingly difficult for the big military contract to justify, spending trillions of dollars on modernizing the nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
And importantly, the alternative is racing, and that's clearly going to end in one way in the long term.
Look, if we've got any listeners that are inspired by what you said and they want to buy the book, but they do feel that they want to change society. Now, I appreciate that myself, who's retired from his corporate job, has probably got a bit more time to read and think and do stuff. A lot of people in their, if they're in mid working career, bringing up a family, they're caught up in this sort of rat race, aren't they? What would you suggest people do? That perhaps little things they can do to make it a better world, shall we say?
Towards the end of the book, go for a set of actions that we can take both collectively and also more individually to help slay Goliath. The individual actions, it's worth remembering, are always still based upon collective action. It's still about working in a broader community to bring about change. And it depends upon who you are. One thing we can all do is we can use the democratic leverage points we already have. Your vote does still matter. And importantly, if you can convince others to vote in such a way in which they take things like nuclear war and climate change seriously, that can have a huge impact. It's a travesty that to this day, not a single election has been decided by topics like nuclear weapons and climate change, despite those being some of the biggest threats we face to our continued existence as a species. So talk to people, share the message, see if you can not just change your own vote, but even change the vote of others, create a more democratic society. And if you can, also try to be more organized with organized social movements and protest movements. In the book, I talk about how for most of human history, we didn't have very big changes in either real income or even human height. Once you get agriculture intensification, people get much shorter, they get far less healthy, and they seem to, in some ways, also get poorer. That doesn't really change for thousands of years, despite the adoption of things like the iron plow, windmills, water mills, etc. What does seem to result in large-scale change is not just technology, but the combination of technology with social movements that struggle to share the benefits of technology. So the Industrial Revolution doesn't de facto lead to progress. People get shorter and their lives get shorter in the UK during the Industrial Revolution. Instead, it's once you get things like the suffragette movement and the rise of unions that you start to get the big victories of things like sanitation, the 40-hour working week, and people start to get healthier, taller, and more literate. But these things demanded shared struggle. And exactly the same is true of today. So I'd encourage people to get more involved with social movements, join a union, etc. And for those of us who, say, for instance, potentially thinking of working in a firm which produces and contributes to global catastrophic risk, my key contention is don't be a dick. Don't work for any kind of firm, company, or organization that is going to directly contribute to doomsday. Don't work for big tech. Don't work for the military-industrial complex, or at the very least arms manufacturers. And don't work for the fossil fuel industry. Pretty simple. And in general, also try...
I guess that would apply for investments
yes,
as well.
Precisely. People should make sure their investments aren't going towards financing our final hour. And it's possible to do that, and it's definitely possible for our big institutional investors to do that. So if you can lobby your pension funds, if you're in Norway, sovereign wealth funds, to divest from things like nuclear weapons and potentially even AI firms. And I think this is also just true of our individual conduct as well. Try to make sure if you're in positions of power to behave well and behave democratically, distribute power where you can, trust for people. In many ways, I think Goliath is fractal. It relies upon having dominance hierarchies in the family, in the workplace, in schools, and that eventually justifies larger levels of hierarchy and dominance. Once we can start to change it at the lower levels, I think it makes it much easier to slay Goliath at a larger scale.
Well, thank you for coming on the show, Luke. It's been great talking to you. And the book itself, Goliath's Curse, that's definitely going at the on the front of the bookshelves, that's for sure. It's one of those books that
Thank you, Robert.
you can sort of pick up now and again. And it's, like I say, it's provoking. It makes you think, but it gives you a firm background in terms of where we are today. What sort of reaction have you had from the book so far?
Overall, very positive. I've been impressed that I've had many people just kind of cold calling me, saying how much they enjoyed the book and how much it changed their perspective, not just on human history, but also the future. In general, most of my colleagues and others from academia seem to really quite like the book, which I was worried about because writing a big history book and going across so many different themes, topics, areas, and kind of expertise points, I was nervous that I'd be able to do a good job, but it seems like it's done pretty well overall. I'm sure there's been people who disagree about bits and pieces, but I'm pretty confident in the overall thrust of it. And on top of that, I think one thing I've liked the most is that people aren't just taking a message of doom from this, but a message of hope as well. That these are all things we can do, that we can escape the end game, and that building a safer world is also building a more just one. And in many ways, just returning back to the civilizations of old. And when I say civilizations here, I mean the big groups of shared culture, genes, and technology we had during the Paleolithic. Having essentially large-scale cooperation without hierarchy and through things like mutual aid and reciprocity. And apart from that, the book's just been going much better than I would have expected. It's a book with around about 100 pages of endnotes and over 1,000 endnotes. So I was skeptical of how much the general public would like it, but it seems to be going well. So thank you all those who've actually brought the book, and hopefully anyone who does buy the book hereafter enjoys it.
And did you, while you were writing it, did it change your own perspective on anything in particular? Was anything that you read or you found and you studied that's in the book that you thought, I never knew that?
Oh, absolutely. One of the criticisms I've faced is, this book is just simply me putting forward my own ideology and trying to find a way to kind of justify it. And I find that funny because prior to writing the book, I was actually someone who felt that maybe we just needed an enlightened dictator to take care of things. I was very frustrated with how things were going with climate change, particularly in Australia. And it felt like maybe just having a stronger hierarchy and having that one despot who could basically create large-scale change was necessary. I think exactly the opposite now. And I think it was kind of silly that I believed that before. And similarly, I think I actually had a pretty grim view of human nature. I'm not sure if I was a full Hobbesian, but I tended to believe that people were by nature pretty selfish and we weren't particularly good at cooperating at scale. We weren't particularly altruistic, etc. And particularly looking at the evidence in the Paleolithic really changed my view on that. And I kind of found it almost funny that I actually had a belief that was different before, because when you think about it, if we were by nature really violent and selfish and non-social, we wouldn't have survived very long. That's a recipe for evolutionary disaster. So research in the book actually obtained many of my oldest assumptions. And I'm definitely a very different thinker and a different person at the end of the book than I was at the start.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. My thanks to Dr. Luke Kemp for a fascinating conversation, one that reminds us just how fragile and how extraordinary human civilization really is. If you enjoyed today's discussion, don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please do leave us a review. It really helps others discover the show. You can find Luke's book, Goliath's Curse, in all good bookshops and online. I highly recommend it. It's an eye-opening journey through the rise and fall of societies and what it might mean for our own future. Join me next time as we uncover more stories that shape the world beneath the surface. Until then, thanks for listening and keep exploring those undercurrents. Thank you for coming on the show, Luke.
My pleasure, Robert. Thank you for having me.